as business owners, there are usually four different podcast goals that we have seen in our research of figuring out where exactly people land in their not only podcast goals, but also their actions that they decide to take to achieve those goals. Today, we're going to be talking through those four podcast goals that we see, as well as some examples of those goals and what those goals might look like, and then some action items that we have seen people take in order to achieve those goals. This is going to be an episode where you're probably going to want to have a piece of paper and a pen and write down what it is your goals are, really come up with some of those numbers, as well as some action items, and deciding on what those action items are that you can use to achieve those goals. Welcome back to another episode of the Listeners to Leads podcast. I'm your host, Alicia Galati. I am the founder of Galati Media, a full-service podcast management agency where we help business owners launch and maintain lead-generating podcasts. Today, we're going to be talking about the four podcast goals that we tend to see. Now, these are very overarching and are very specific to business owners. So business owners who have a podcast where they're looking to generate leads with their show. The first is audience conversion. Now, audience conversion tends to look like they want to turn their podcast listeners into potential leads for their business. The second is audience impact. They're trying to educate their audience. They want to move their information and their audience from feeling a certain way into feeling another way. So they're trying to make that impact. This one also has a lot to do with creating a visible brand. They want to expand their reach. They want to expand the people that it is that are listening to their show, but they want to make sure that they're doing it in a way that's educating. The third one is podcast audience growth. Now, in this one, this is one where a lot of people focus, but I want you to consider as you're listening to these, which one it is that you want to focus on most. If you had to pick one, and there are going to be some overlapping things here. If you had to pick one, which one would it be as the most important one that you want to focus on? So for audience growth, that is very clearly you want to increase the number of listeners that your podcast has. And then the fourth one is audience engagement. You want your listeners to engage with you beyond just your podcast episodes. So that's going to look like an increase in social media mentions, social media follows, and things like that. That one is also going to look a lot like community building. You want to grow an audience that is going to engage with you in some way and take that to the next level beyond just your podcast. Like I said, a lot of these will overlap, but I want you to consider of the four, which is the one that you want to focus on the most in the next 6 months? Is it your audience conversion, audience impact, audience growth, or audience engagement? Now we're going to go through each of these and give some examples as well as some tools and tricks and strategies that you can use to achieve these goals. An audience conversion goal example might look like you want to take some of your listeners, a percentage of your listeners, and convert them into your coaching services. So that is an example of what a goal might look like around audience conversion. Now, here I want you to really, if you're going to come up with numbers, don't just arbitrarily do that. Consider what is the industry standard. If you're looking at a typical conversion rate for your audience, think, okay, I run a promotion or I run a freebie or a webinar. What does that typical promotion conversion look like? And then from my podcast, how many listeners do I have? And then obviously we're going to increase those listeners as well. But how many listeners do I have? And what does that number look like to convert them? To achieve this, there are some things you're going to want to do. I'm going to give you a few examples of ways to achieve this type of audience conversion. The first is you're going to need to increase your audience. And this goes across the board with all of these. For the audience increase goal, that is obviously going to be the focus. But for all of these, increasing your audience in some way, shape, or form is going to be really, really important. So I would like you to increase your audience by being a guest on other people's podcasts. And I want you to be really strategic about it, but don't pull back on the number of podcasts that you're a guest on. The number one way to grow your podcast audience is to be a guest on other people's show. We've talked about it so much here, but I want you to really make sure that you're focusing on that first and foremost. Then some other tips and tricks that you can use for that audience conversion is making sure that you have a dynamic ad on your podcast where you talk about your services, you talk about what it is that you do with your clients, and find ways to share examples within your episodes. I would say 8 out of 10 of your next solo episodes give clear examples of ways to work with you and some examples of things that your clients have achieved through working with you. So, those are just a few of the strategies that you can use to turn those listeners into leads and create that audience conversion. Moving on to your audience impact. So some goals examples might be that you want to increase the social mentions and shares from your podcast content. Now, in order to do that, you're going to need to grow your social presence and make sure that the content you're sharing about your podcast is high quality. You're also going to increase your audience through strategic podcast guesting. And then another way is to create and nurture an email audience. Make sure that you are educating your audience, that you are talking about your podcast episodes and encouraging them to also share those episodes. So those are some ways that you can achieve some audience impact and achieve that goal of wanting to get more social shares for your podcast and from your podcast. The third is some audience growth examples. So we're going to give one here. That is that you want to double your 30-day podcast episode download number by the end of that 6 months. When it comes to doubling your 30-day downloads, what I mean by that is if you look at your podcast stats, you can see how many downloads an episode has gotten within that first 30 days of that episode going live. That is what I mean. So you want to double that number within 6 months, which means that the episodes you're creating 6 months from now are getting double that number. So say that your podcast is getting 300 downloads within the first 30 days of an episode going live. Then you would want to make sure that that number is increased to 600 downloads within that first 30 days. The reason that I like to use that 30-day window is that podcast listeners are bingers. They don't always listen week to week. Yes, there are some episodes and some podcasts where they will show up on the day that it comes out and they will listen on that day. But most listeners, they might end up just kind of holding off and then listening to 5 of your last episodes in a row so that they can just binge through all of them. Think Netflix style binging. That is how podcast listeners like to listen. So giving them those options of that 30-day window, it paints a really realistic picture for you, and it allows your listeners to have some time before you start freaking out about downloads. So for that audience growth, we're obviously going to give you some 3 things that you can do. Obviously going to make sure that we are pitching ourselves to be on other people's podcasts. That is number 1. Share about your podcast at least 1 week outside of your normal marketing strategies. So if you are sharing on TikTok or you are sharing on LinkedIn about your latest episode, I want you to find one way every single week that you can go outside of your norm. Maybe that means that you go into a Facebook group and you notice that someone is asking for help on a question of a podcast episode that you've recently launched. Or maybe it's an episode that went live a year ago, but the information is still super valuable. These are ways that you can go outside of your normal marketing and talk about your podcast. Maybe you're a sports mom like me. Like I have 2 boys and they are really into sports. And so obviously I get to talking to the other parents, and that would be a way where I can say, oh, you're in business or you enjoy listening to podcasts. Have you ever considered launching a podcast? Is that something you're interested in doing? Well, I have resources for that. And then I can share about my podcasts. So these are all ways that you can do that, but make sure that you're sharing your podcast and about your podcast at least once a week outside of your normal marketing. And third, engage with potential listeners and current listeners on social media beyond just your marketing. So most podcasters, and I don't really understand this, but most people will actually just post and ghost. Not cool. We don't like that. Don't just post about your episodes on social media and then move on. You need to dedicate some time. I would say every single week, I like to spend an hour on each of the platforms and engage beyond just my normal posting or my normal engagement. So I might be on Instagram scrolling through reels, but that doesn't count towards my engagement. Instead, I set aside an intentional hour where I will go through and I will engage with people who I know could potentially be listeners for my podcast, people who I know are going to enjoy the content that I'm creating. So these are very simple and very easy ways to get outside of our normal everyday. I'm sharing my podcast, I'm marketing it. Get outside of that. That is how you're going to get that audience growth in the next 6 months. And finally, if your goal is audience engagement, then an example of that could look like increasing your average episode completion rate to more than 80%. Now, what we've seen, and there's no general data to back this up, but from what we've seen with our clients, the average completion rate of a podcast episode tends to be around 60 to 75% of an episode. So most people will complete about that much of an episode. You're going to want to have to go into the back end of your episodes and of your podcast stats within each podcast listening app to get this information. So if Apple Podcasts is your number one podcast listening app for your audience, great place to look. They make it super easy to pull that information and see what that average completion rate looks like. You can pull that, you can run some numbers. Or if you're feeling like, wait a minute, that feels really overwhelming, you can always book a strategy session and we'll talk through and walk through how to look at these stats, as well as some tips, tricks, and strategies that you can use to improve that number. But you can look at those. Spotify doesn't make it as easy. You have to go into the back end of each of those episodes, but you'll be able to get a general idea if you go into the last 10 episodes to see what is that completion rate and where are people tending to drop off when it comes to your podcast episodes. Now, this will give you a lot of information, but when it comes to audience engagement, if your idea is to get your audience to engage with your content and you're talking about your services or you're talking about how to connect with you further at the end of your episode, then they're missing it. So you need to make sure that you're having something at the beginning that talks about where to connect with you, where to hang out with you, where to find you if your goal is engagement. But that could be a goal, is to increase that completion rate to above 80%. So some action items that you can take to increase that audience engagement is obviously to increase your audience by making sure that you're pitching to be on other people's podcasts. Another thing that you can do is track your stats. So you're going to want to look in there, I would say every month, every 2 or 3 months, 3 months at most, to see what is actually working, what content is working. Are there episodes that are really getting that engagement, and are there ones that are not? We have found that some of our clients, their solo episodes will do so fantastically, will do so great. And then their guest episodes will get way fewer downloads, and the completion rates on those are not as good. With that in mind, when we've talked to these clients, we've said, well, is the goal to connect with these guests and get in front of these guests, or is it for your audience to enjoy the conversation? Some clients say, oh, I don't want to have these guests on anymore. I want to increase the number of solo episodes I'm doing. While other clients have said, I think I want to keep getting in front of these people. And so having those guests on is a great way to get in front of them. The third way that you can create that action item to increase that audience engagement is to encourage your audience to send you an email or a message. So if you are wanting to get feedback on what is working or what's not on your podcast, maybe at the beginning of your episode, you say, hey, I would like to know what you're enjoying from this episode. I'd like to know what you're not enjoying. Please send me an email at this or fill out this form to let me know. It takes 2 minutes, make it super easy and simple, and then get that feedback and actually implement it to create more engaging content that your audience is going to want to listen all the way through. Now that we've talked through these 4 podcast goals, I want to know what your goals are. Let me know in the comments, send me a DM, and let me know which of these you've decided that you're going to focus on over the next 6 months, and maybe some of those action items that you plan on taking. Again, we have strategy sessions that you can book. We have our mini audits, which will allow you to not only just sit there and get all of the information, but allows us to be able to go into your podcast, really hone into what your goals are for your show in order to be able to give you tips, tricks, and strategies that are geared towards you and are actually going to work in growing your podcast in whichever of these ways you would like it to grow. I hope this was valuable, and I know that you're going to get tons of value from it, but make sure that you are looking at this from a singular point of view, and make sure that you are looking at it as there is one thing that I want to achieve in the next 6 months, and that is this goal. If you allow yourself to be distracted and pulled in multiple different ways, and we've seen clients do this where they will be focused on one goal and then another goal will come up, or they'll see somebody else mention something that makes them think, oh, I need to be focusing on that, when that's not really true. What they need to be focusing on is the goal that they've set and really achieve that goal over the next 6 months and then change it. If you decide that you want to, that's okay. But pick one to focus on. The others will come along with it, but make sure that you're focusing on one singular goal and working on that to achieve those podcast goals. I do not believe that there's one singular way to have a successful podcast. I believe that there are so many different ways, and that it really boils down to what your goals are and how you would like to achieve them.